What's next for Oregon football on the recruiting trail following two new commitments from the transfer portal? Well, now our attention turns to two more big names on the high school ranks, and we're going to be previewing both of their commitments on the Ducks Dish podcast. And we're back like we never left. Oregon fans, what's going on? How we living? Hope everybody is having an awesome day. And thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Ducks Dish podcast. In case you're new here, I'm your host, Max Torres, publisher and lead editor of Ducks Digest, covering the Oregon Ducks over on Fan Nation, part of the Sports Illustrated Network. Really excited to have you guys along for another episode of the Ducks Dish podcast. And we are going to be taking a big recruiting focus once again because the Ducks are red hot on the recruiting trail and in the transfer portal, landing two new commitments on Monday morning and afternoon from former East Carolina offensive lineman Nishad Strother and former Colorado cornerback Nikko, who teams up with Demetrius Martin once again in Eugene to solidify Oregon's secondary. Totally new look in the secondary for Oregon in 2023 after adding multiple corners and multiple safeties. If you guys want to hear more about those commitments, you can find them on my YouTube channel or on your podcasting platform of choice. But now we always move on to the important question in recruiting. You can never dwell on one commitment or two commitments for that matter because you're always faced with what's next. So what's next for Oregon on the recruiting trail? Well, there are two big-time high school recruits. There are two big-time high school recruits that are going to be coming off the board this weekend. So we're going to be previewing their commitments on today's episodes of the Ducks Dish podcast. And starting off with the biggest name in Oregon recruiting right now, we're going to be looking at Baltimore, Maryland, St. Francis Academy quarterback Michael Van Buren. If you don't know the story with Michael Van Buren at this point, I'd be kind of shocked because he's such a huge name, but just in case you don't, I'll make sure to get you up to speed. Michael Van Buren is a four-star quarterback out of St. Francis Academy. He's rated a four-star on the 247 Sports Composite, .9412. He's ranked the number 129 player nationally, the number 11 quarterback, and the number 3 player in the state of Maryland. He's going to be making his announcement on Saturday, May 20th at 1 p.m. Pacific time. So if you're out on the West Coast, 1 Pacific, and then if you're out there on the East Coast, 4 p.m. And Van Buren, this is a highly anticipated decision for him. He came out with a final 3 of Oregon, Penn State, and Maryland earlier on this spring. And the Ducks are really surging in this recruitment, seeing that they hosted him on campus for multiple unofficial visits, that is, in the month of April, nearly on back-to-back weekends. So Van Buren has clearly made it a priority to get out to Eugene, and that's a clear sign of interest in any recruitment. You know, I've talked a lot about it, the importance of tracking those visits, where recruits are getting out to. So I think that's part of the reason that Duck fans should be really confident about where they stand in this recruitment right now with Michael Van Buren. But two other big schools are in the mix here, right? You have Maryland, led by Mike Loxley in Van Buren's home state. Maybe not the strongest on-product production, or not the strongest production just from a season standpoint in 2022. Definitely not a recruiting power, but I think that he has that program going in the right direction. And then you always have that element of staying home and playing for your home state that's going to have some pull with most recruits. And then you also have the Penn State Nittany Lions. God, I'm getting my words mixed up today. The Penn State Nittany Lions, led by James Franklin. They are a recruiting power. I think they have a top 10 class right now in the 247 Sports rankings. So they're definitely the biggest threat to Oregon, I think, in this recruitment. They were at one point viewed as the leader for the commitment of Michael Van Buren during his recruitment. But like I said, those two visits out to Eugene, I think really solidified Oregon's standing in this recruitment and have made them the team to beat. And another important aspect in this recruitment is that it looks like Oregon is pretty all in on signing 2 quarterbacks in the 2024 recruiting class. Of course, already holding a verbal commitment from Phoenix, Arizona, Sunny Slope quarterback Luke Moga, who committed on April 28th, just the day before Oregon's spring game. When I brought him on the podcast, he said that he wanted to do it then on his original date because, in part, he wanted to help recruit while he was at the spring game. And Moga has talked about how he's not afraid of the competition. He's confident in his abilities, and he's actually recruiting Van Buren along with a number of other Duck commits. They're also recruiting Van Buren to join them in this 2024 class in Eugene. So Michael Van Buren is a very important recruit for Will Stein, Dan Lanning, and the rest of this offensive staff, because you're ultimately trying to figure out what's next after Bo Nix. I think you can head into the 2024 season with a ton of confidence that Bo Nix is your guy and he's going to help get this team where it wants to go. But in 2024, it's kind of a little bit of murky waters right now, because you don't enter the 2024 season, knowing who your starting quarterback is going to be. Could it be Ty Thompson? Could it be Austin Novosad? Could it be Luke Moga? Or could it be Michael Van Buren if he decides to hop in the fold? If we see any shakeup at that position, could it necessarily maybe be a transfer that comes in during the offseason for that starting quarterback job? So there's a lot of layers that go into this recruitment, and what a commitment would mean for Oregon if they are able to, in fact, land Van Buren. And maybe that's a little segue into the next, part of this commitment preview. What would a commitment from Michael Van Buren mean for the Ducks? I think that if they are able to get Van Buren in the fold, that's an Under Armour All-American caliber quarterback that is going to have some national pull with other recruits. So if you're able to get him in the fold, I think it's only going to really strengthen your case with some of these other top recruits that you're going after in the 2024 class. Namely, you're looking at wide receivers. Some other wide receivers that the Ducks are recruiting. They already have 2 in the fold, mind you, in Tysier Denmark and Jordan Anderson. A couple other receiver recruits that the Ducks are heavily pursuing in this class. You got Dylan Gresham out of San Jacinto High School in Southern California. Aaron Butler out of Calabasas is another strong option for Oregon, although I believe that Colorado is the trending favorite in that recruitment. You also have James Madison II out of St. Thomas Aquinas in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. He has Oregon in his top 5 schools. Both he and Dan Lanning are Kansas City natives, so that's a little bit of the pull there. You also have Jeremiah McClellan out of St. Louis Christian Brothers, who was recently on campus, and he's going to be back for an official visit. So if you can get 2 strong quarterbacks in the fold here, I think it's really going to help your pitch with other elite offensive options in the 2024 recruiting class. You're also looking at, some big-time offensive linemen like Brandon Baker, the 5-star tackle out of Mater Dei in Santa Ana, California. You're also looking at someone else like you're looking at Eddie Pierre-Louis out of the state of Florida. He's another big-time prospect that the Ducks are recruiting and pursuing here in 2024. Bennett Warren out of Sugar Land, Texas, Fort Bend Christian Academy. So I think that that's the point I'm really trying to make here with Michael Van Buren is if the Ducks are, in fact, able to get a commitment from him, I think it could really bolster their recruiting rankings and even push them further towards their goals. I think right now they have the number 7 class in the 247 Sports class rankings, tops in the Pac-12. And I think that there's definitely going to be a battle on the recruiting trail with Oregon and USC moving forward, even though USC has been favoring the transfer portal since Lincoln Riley became the head coach out in Los Angeles. So what else can we talk about with this commitment preview? I mean, Will Stein, he's already landed 2 quarterbacks in the brief amount of time that he's been the offensive coordinator in Eugene on Dan Lanning's staff. Of course, flipping Austin Novosad from Baylor in the 2023 recruiting class, and then also most recently landing Luke Moga. The interesting thing with Luke Moga, just to add another tidbit here, is that the staff, one of the main selling points for Luke Moga with the Oregon coaching staff is that they do see a lot of Bo Nix in his game. Luke Moga is about 6'2", 200 pounds, so they're a little bit similar from a physical standpoint. Obviously, they're both tremendously gifted athletes with their legs and with their arm, the ability to throw off platform, to scramble, to improvise, and just get things done. I think that's kind of what stands out a little bit with Luke Moga. But this is an important recruitment for Will Stein and the Ducks. Make no mistake about it. I mean, they've really been playing the long game with Michael Van Buren, recruiting him. The Ducks were, at least the University of Oregon was, before Dan Lanning and Will Stein were even hired. But perhaps there's no more important position than quarterback for Oregon to hit on here in the 2024 class, because what I just mentioned, this is the last season of Bo Nix, so you've got to kind of figure it out and give yourself some options. I think Luke Moga has tremendous upside, especially from an athletic standpoint. But if you're looking at these two guys, I think that Van Buren is your more polished passer and gives you a little bit more, of a steady floor from a recruit standpoint, and maybe somebody that you're a little bit more confident in contributing early, maybe even competing for the job as a true freshman. And keep in mind here that that's not something that's common in today's era of college football. There are very few quarterbacks that are talented enough to start as true freshmen. And at least right now, if Van Buren were to commit, he'd have to beat out Luke Moga, Austin Novosad, and Ty Thompson, who's been in Eugene for a couple years now and looks like he's feeling more comfortable heading into 2023. And, ultimately with this commitment preview and with this decision that's looming for Michael Van Buren, I logged my prediction for Van Buren to become a Duck for a variety of reasons, right? You have the frequency of visits. I think the timing plays into a lot of that. He previously said he was going to announce his commitment on July 8th. And then shortly after visiting Oregon again for the spring game to close out the month of April, he decides to move his commitment date up, right, to Saturday, May 20th. So I think that if you look at that and you kind of read between the lines, you can kind of see that Oregon would be viewed as the perceived favorite. He's spoken highly of Will Stein and their relationship, the direction that he has the offense going. He's spoken about, much like Moga did, being confident in his abilities as a quarterback if Oregon does indeed end up taking two quarterbacks in this class. And we've seen every indication that is their plan here in the 2024 class. And then they're coming off of a 2023 class that was very strong, amazing class under Dan Lanning, and they're trying to push to have the best recruiting class in program history, which I think they are more than capable of doing. And if you can get two quality quarterbacks in the fold and you do that before summer, I think you're really setting yourself up for some tremendous success and a serious recruiting run on the trail here, seeing that you want to do that heavy lifting, like I've said a million times, in the spring, in the summer months. And I think that's what they have the opportunity to do here with Van Buren announcing his commitment on May 20th. Trying to think of any other aspects that we can add here in this commitment preview, but I think that Michael Van Buren is definitely a really exciting prospect to look at. The Ducks were involved with Dylan Raiola at one point, the number one player in the country out of Phoenix, Arizona Pinnacle High School. He announced his commitment to Georgia on Monday. So the quarterback dominoes are starting to fall here in the 2024 class. They've been falling for a little bit now, and Oregon didn't want to find themselves, empty-handed. There's definitely a shortage of top tier quarterbacks in the 2024 class, especially when you're comparing it to 2023. And the Ducks were pretty fortunate to end the 2023 cycle the way that they did, seeing that they had a commitment from Dante Moore, one of the best quarterbacks in the country, absolutely shredded everybody in the Adidas All-American Bowl out in San Antonio earlier this year in January. But when he flipped to UCLA, a lot of Oregon fans were concerned, but Will Stein just showed up and said, "Oh, have no fear. Let me tap into my Texas ties and let me flip Austin Novosad, a guy that Ohio State, Notre Dame, other big-time schools, Texas A&M as well, I think, they all made a run at Austin Novosad. and he wasn't budging, but Will Stein goes in and he's able to shake that thing up and get the Ducks another blue chip All-American passer in the 2023 class. So figuring out the quarterback picture and giving yourself really good options like a Michael Van Buren, they're vital to the long-term success and the long-term health of your program. So I think that that's about all I have for Michael Van Buren's commitment preview. But as of right now, all signs are pointing towards Michael Van Buren becoming the newest Duck in Oregon's 2024 recruiting class come Saturday. All right, the next player that we are going to be previewing, the next commitment preview for us here on today's episode of the Ducks Dish podcast is a big-time talent in the trenches. We're talking about Durant, Oklahoma, Durant High School, defensive lineman Zadavian Sims. Zadavian Sims is a big name on the recruiting trail of late, in part because he is the number one player in the state of Oklahoma. Not a state that Oregon has recruited super heavily in recent years. I think that one name that some recruiting fans might be familiar with from the state of Oklahoma is Miles Slusher, a former safety in the 2020 class out of Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. He ended up committing to Arkansas and then transferred most recently to Colorado. So like I said, Oklahoma is not a state that the Ducks have done a ton of work in of late, but, they're more than willing to go into any state and try to compete for top tier talent, as has been the case under Dan Lanning. So what's the story with Zadavian Sims? Well, just to get you a little bit of background info on Zadavian Sims and the caliber of guy that we're dealing with here. He's a 4-star defensive lineman rated 0.9263, on the 247 Sports Composite. The same system ranks him the number 194 player nationally, the number 23 defensive lineman, and the number 2 player. So the number 2 player in the state of Oklahoma. 247 Sports has him at number 1 in the state, but the 247 Sports Composite, which factors in other recruiting services, has him at number 2. He's got 22 reported scholarships to his name. So this is a guy who has a national recruitment interest in schools from coast to coast. And Oregon's really come on strong here in the spring months with Zadavian Sims as their defensive line big board kind of comes into shape. Another thing that's worth noting here, as we kind of have our eyes set on Saturday's commitment announcement from Zadavian Sims, is that the Ducks do have a couple of defensive linemen in the fold already in 2024, starting with Yuma Catholic edge rusher Jackson Jones. Whether you think of an edge rusher as an outside linebacker or a defensive lineman is up to you. But for this exercise, I'm just going to say he's a defensive lineman, but he is an edge rusher out on the outside. So, smaller frame at like 6'3", 220, I want to say. And then another big boy in the trenches, the Ducks have a commitment from Florissant, Missouri, Hazelwood Central defensive lineman Tioni Gray, who the Ducks flipped from the in-state Missouri Tigers earlier this spring following a visit out to Eugene. So we've seen it time and time again, just how much weight these unofficial visits carry when they're able to get them on campus and ultimately show them what Dan Lanning and the Ducks are building behind the scenes. So with Zadavian, I think that's a perfect note that's worth mentioning. Zadavian Sims is a recruit that hasn't been shy about his interest in Oregon. And how can you tell? Well, you can tell because he's taken a pair of unofficial visits out to Eugene this spring, almost in back-to-back weeks. I don't have the dates off the top of my head, but I remember it was just after he had visited Oregon. There was another story that was coming out that he was taking another trip out to see the Ducks. And the interesting thing there with his timing is that you have those 2 trips to Oregon, right, in the spring. And then, kind of around that same time, I was talking to a source close to that recruitment, and I was being told that Zadavian was kind of going to go about the process in a slower manner, take his official visits, get a feel for what programs have to offer. And, taking those OVs gives you an even closer look at what those schools have to offer, what their vision is for you. Kind of get the red carpet treatment, right? But depending on the player, schools like Oregon will roll out a red carpet and make an unofficial visit, kind of have that feel, have that appeal, and that priority of an official visit. So the deal with Zadavian is that he took that recent trip to Oregon, the second of two unofficial visits this spring. And then what happened after that? Well, what happened after that is Zadavian Sims announced that he was going to be narrowing his recruitment to 5 schools. And those 5 schools include Oregon, Oklahoma, Vanderbilt, Michigan State, and TCU. So you really have schools from across the country, like I mentioned, but Oregon's definitely the farthest from Oklahoma. So that's definitely worth a mention there. I think that with this recruitment, Michigan State is probably being viewed as the biggest threat for Oregon right now, as they're pursuing the big-time defensive lineman from the state of Oklahoma. I think that is the school that he's visited the most during this recruitment process. But those 2 recent trips to Oregon should not be taken lightly at all, seeing that we've seen the recency of visits play into recruits' commitments time and time again. The example that I like to use is that Kayvon Thibodeau wasn't really considering Oregon too much, and then he visited in 2018 for the Washington game, and that was the game that Duck fans remember. Oregon was able to get back on top of Washington with that kind of walk-off style win in overtime when CJ Verdell pounds it up the middle, and then Otson's going insane. Kayvon was raving about the atmosphere and his experience, and then the next thing you know, Mario Cristobal and the Ducks land a commitment from the number 1 player in the country, Kayvon Thibodeau. So I'm not saying that that's the case here with Zadavian Sims. I've been doing some digging, and I think that Oregon feels very confident in their chances here with Zadavian Sims. But, we're not going to know ultimately until Saturday. I'm still trying to talk to some sources and get a better feel for this one myself. But I think my feel for this one is that Oregon is firmly in the top 2 out of those top 5 schools. I think also, like we were talking about with Van Buren and his timeline, his sequence of events, I think that you saw you're just reading between the lines here with Zadavian Sims. You see him take those 2 visits, and you see him come out with a top 5, and then he takes it one step further and say, hey, I'm ready to wrap this thing up. Let's get this thing wrapped up on Saturday, May 20th. And I think, if you're looking at the staff's approach with commitments, I've talked about how timing plays a very pivotal role when it comes to recruiting. The fact that Van Buren is announcing his commitment on the same day as Zadavian Sims could lead me to believe that Oregon is the team to beat for Zadavian. But I mean, I think you kind of have to take that with a grain of salt. I don't think it's something that you can, make your prediction off of just because you have 2 high-level Oregon targets announcing on the same day. But another note with Zadavian's recruitment is that Oregon has taken advantage of the spring eval period. Tony Tuioti got on a plane and flew out to Durant in Oklahoma to check out Zadavian, get that important FaceTime with one of his top defensive line recruits in the 2024 class. So I think that's something that's worth a mention as well. All those things factor into, how a recruit perceives the effort from a given recruiting staff and the sense of being a priority. You have all these recruits in the class that can't all be a priority, but I think that within a position, obviously there's a handful of guys that you're going after. And, at the end of the day, you only have so many hours to fly across the country and shake hands, meet coaches, meet parents, meet family, whatever it is. And Tony Tuioti decided that it was going to be in his best interest to go out to Oklahoma and put in a little bit of extra work on the recruiting trail with Zadavian. This is a really athletic guy. You can see it on the tape. He's explosive. He's powerful. And I think he fits the mold of, previous Oregon defensive linemen under Dan Lanning, right? That they recruited in the 2023 class, right? You see a guy like a Zadavian Sims, and you can see some very obvious similarities with some of the other guys they signed. Zadavian Sims listed on 247 at 6'3", 275 pounds, which is a pretty similar build to, Terrence Green. He was a defensive lineman out of Texas. Tafita Pomee, he was a big 300-pounder out of the state of Utah in 2023. And then you also have Michael Gardner, Amari Washington, all guys that are within the 270 to 290, 300-pound range. I'm sure that's where the staff wants to get Zadavian if he is going to be at Oregon. Also worth mentioning, Johnny Bowens, the second, who's also from the state of Texas. Ashton Porter, another edge guy, defensive lineman from the state of Texas. So I think that they kind of laid the foundation and laid the blueprint in 2023, and they're trying to pick up right where they left off once again with Zadavian Sims here in 2024. And another thing with his game is that, he's super athletic, and I think the staff sees a lot of position versatility with his game. You're not just looking at a D end. You're looking at a guy that maybe you add a little more weight to his frame, and you can kick him inside to play some of that, that zero technique or that 4-eye technique maybe. So I think that Zadavian Sims is exactly what Oregon's looking for along the defensive line. Maybe similar in stature a little bit to Mateo Uyunglele, who was like 6'5", 270. And he played some tight end when he was playing his high school ball for St. John Bosco in Bellflower, California. And Zadavian played some tight end as well, playing some 7-on-7 ball with C4, his 7-on-7 organization. And I think I actually saw Zadavian at a 7-on-7 tournament that I was covering in Santa Ana, but I had no idea who he was at the time. So that kind of just lets you know a little bit more about how strong Oregon has come on in his recruitment here of late. I think that a commitment from Zadavian Sims would be massive. It would be another, vote of confidence and, vote of faith in Tony Tuioti and what he's been able to do and will continue to do along the defensive line. Tony Washington is another guy that has been playing a role in this recruitment and in the recruitment of various defensive linemen for Oregon in the 2024 class, because this is a position, the defensive line, where Oregon is really swinging for the fences, right? I had a podcast about that recently, last month, I want to say, or earlier this month, because they're going after some huge names here in the 2024 class. You have edge rusher Jordan Ross out of the state of Alabama. You have Elijah Rushing out of Tucson, Arizona, Sal Point Catholic. You have Jericho Johnson, big-time defensive lineman, 300-pounder out of NorCal, Northern California. Armijo High School, I think is what it's called. I need to double-check on that. Maybe in the Fairfield area is kind of what the details that are coming to mind with that one. You also have Williams Nwaneri, the number one defensive lineman in the country, out of the state of Missouri as well. So Dan Lanning's trying to go back to his home state to get some big names, and Williams Nwaneri recently put Oregon in his top 10, and I believe Steve Wiltfong reported that Oregon was going to get an official visit there. That's huge. They're also going after Dylan Stewart, a big-time edge rusher out of Washington, D.C. Maybe he's trending towards Georgia right now, but you've got to take your shots with some of these guys along the D-line. David Stone, also formerly from Oklahoma, but now he's at IMG Academy out in Bradenton, Florida. So Oregon's going after a lot of big names here along the defensive line in 2024. You're not going to get all of them, but I think that you have a very, very realistic shot with Zadavian Sims here in this recruitment. Like I said, I'm not predicting him to Oregon right now. I think I have to do a little bit more digging, but I could certainly see the case for why Oregon could be the call here. I know that Michigan State has done a very good job in terms of the defensive line recruiting. I think they're popping up more and more with other big-time defensive linemen in the 2024 class and beyond. I know that they're really prioritizing Dylan Williams out of Long Beach Poly. He's a major Oregon linebacker target. But, Mel Tucker has the blueprint, right? He's one of those former Alabama coaches that was able to get his own program to head up. And I think that speaks a lot about, the confidence that, coaches, parents, fans, players have in his ability to recruit. So I don't think I'm necessarily going to go as far as predicting Zadavian Sims to Oregon right now. But like I mentioned, I think that at the very worst, they're at number 2 for him. I think that's probably looking like an Oregon versus Michigan State battle. But, Oklahoma is another school that's firmly in the mix there in the top 5. And that Brent Venables isn't going to let the state's top players, the state's top talent, go without a fight. So this is going to be one that Oregon has to battle very hard in until the very end. And Zadavian Sims will announce his college commitment on Saturday, May 20th. I don't think he has a time yet. We just know that it's Saturday, May 20th at the C4 Pro Day out there in Durant, Oklahoma. So those are some of the biggest names that you need to keep an eye on for Oregon football recruiting in the 2024 class, fresh off the commitments from transfer portal offensive lineman Nishad Strother out of East Carolina, and Nikko Reed, the Colorado cornerback transfer. So that's going to do it for the Ducks Dish podcast today. Quick favor to ask of you guys, please do me a favor and support the channel by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It is completely free, and that means a lot in terms of just what I'm doing, trying to give you guys the best coverage possible of the Ducks on the recruiting trail. And then also make sure to hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any future episodes or live streams. And then make sure you lock in with me on social media. I am at Torres Sports on Twitter and Instagram, and I'm on YouTube at Oregon Football Max Torres. Until next time, thank you guys so much for taking some time out of your day to talk some Duck football and some Duck recruiting with me. And we'll see you on the next episode of the Ducks Dish podcast.